Hello, everyone. Today I kind of wanted to talk about Flower of Evil as a good case study for the 3-act structure that is so often employed in storytelling, be it novels or films or shows, and so on. I think the 3-act structure is something that every screenwriter is very aware of, and it has enduring popularity because it is the framework that keeps the audience most engaged. So it has a lot to do with the pacing of a show as well. And it's very nice to see it play out in a show like Flower of Evil. It is very tightly written. It is very satisfying the way that the whole show is paced, and I think it's because the writer very deftly employs their skills and their techniques, such as this. What is also very clever is that the script, the plots of the show does not strictly adhere to this structure as well. There are certain parts with which adhere really strictly, but there are some divergences as well, especially in the third act. And I think it works well. In my opinion, the writing is the shining star of the show, and of course the acting and directing, it all comes together. So let's talk a little bit about that. So what is the 3-act structure? So it's basically how a story develops. So you have 3 acts. The first act, it starts off with a hook, so something interesting that gets the audience engaged. And then you introduce the protagonist, you introduce the characters, their relationships maybe, and you introduce the world that they live in. So this is the status quo. And shortly after that, you introduce an inciting incident. And this is the incident, something that happens that shakes up the status quo. So something is revealed or something happens, and everything about the world is like shaken. All right, and the protagonist has a kind of call to action, like they have to do something. And the rest of Act 1 really is them either ignoring this call to action, trying to kind of push it away, or it's about them preparing to take action. And then towards the end of the Act 1, you have something called the lock-in, or some people call it the Act 1 climax, where the protagonist decides that, okay, they're gonna do something about it. So they might pursue a villain, or join a force or something like that. So that would be the end of Act 1. Act 2 would be the longest act in the story, and it's usually split into 2 parts. So the first part is what some people call fun and games. So this is a part where tension is not so high yet, and then new characters might be introduced, or I've heard people say, this is where in buddy cop comedies you would have the 2 characters kind of going head to head, and some training, preparing for a journey or something like that. In Flower of Evil, it's not that light, actually. Flower of Evil is a very emotionally heavy show, and I would argue that this part all the way to the midpoint of Act 2 is actually a very important emotional arc for Ji-won, especially. Ji-won is not the protagonist of this story. The protagonist is Hyun-soo, but obviously the relationship that husband and wife have is the basis of this show, and she herself needs to go through a journey as well, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. And then after that, you would reach the midpoint of Act 2, and this is where the protagonist reaches like a high or a low point, or comes to a kind of revelation. And you see that, I think, in episode 11 of Flower of Evil. So after that, the story starts getting really serious. You start raising the stakes of the story, and this is where the protagonist starts to get ready for like the big fight and things like that. So you get a real sense of tension and danger here. I would argue that this is very similar to what happens in the drama. Then you reach the end of Act 2, and this is really the protagonist's lowest point. They meet the antagonist, something happens, and they are at the lowest point that they could possibly be. They would call this the all is lost moment. And what follows after that is called the dark night of the soul, where the protagonist just spirals into a really dark place, and maybe it's a time of losing confidence in themselves. So then we come to the end of Act 2, where the protagonist essentially comes out. Maybe somebody had pep talked him, and he or she comes out of this dark place, and then they have this aha moment where they come to the realization of how they can defeat the enemy or something. So from the lowest point, really, is like the gears start moving towards a resolution. So Act 3 tends to move really, really quickly, where tensions are high, and there might be a twist somewhere in Act 3 before their final confrontation, before the final climax. There might be a twist before they reach the climax, the final climax. And usually in superhero movies, this is where they have the big battle scenes, and everything happens really quickly towards that point. And once that happens, really the story just goes into the falling action portion, where any loose ends are tied up. Flower of Evil, just listening to me talk about this, you probably have a sense of how much of Flower of Evil actually does adhere to this structure, with some differences, I think. So let's start way from the beginning. Alright, so of course we are introduced to Hee-sung and Ji-won and their daughter, and the status quo really is that they are a happy family. Ji-won is a detective, she's very smart, and Hee-sung just seems like the perfect husband. And I would think that the inciting incident is when Moojin comes, and Moojin realizes that this is not Hee-sung, that is Hyun-soo. And at that point, really, like, it's either he admits it or he completely looks away, but he does admit that he is Hyun-soo. What happens after that is that there are murders, and they are copycat murders to what happened with Hyun-soo's dad. So Hyun-soo's dad used to kill people before he eventually died himself, and the style of the murder is very similar to his dad, the way that his dad murdered people. And I would say that the lock-in might be when he decides to go and look for the man behind it all, because he's not the one doing these. So he goes to look for Kyung-chun, and he finds out that his dad has an accomplice, and he decides that he is going to look for the accomplice. So this, I would say, would be the lock-in point of Hyun-soo's journey. So at this point, we realize that Ji-won had figured out, or had found out, that her husband is not who he said he was. And so this is essentially a cat and mouse arc of the first part of Act 2, where they're kind of like trying to hide what they know of each other. Hyun-soo doesn't know that his wife knows, and but it becomes like increasingly apparent, and Jiwon goes through this entire emotional journey. Their marriage is breaking apart because of the lies. And actress Moon Chae-won had said before, that Jiwon is somebody who stays the same. And that's what makes her so strong and so steadfast. But of course she has to go through an emotional arc as well, because this relationship between husband and wife is the basis of this entire show. Without their bond, what is this show? So her journey, I think, takes center stage for the first arc, for the first part of Act 2. And at the same time, Hyun-soo, in his growing desperation to hang on to this facade of Hee-sung, also causes him a lot of tension. So whereas in other shows this part of the arc may not be as tension filled, it is in Flower of Evil because of things starting to fall apart for Hyun-soo, and definitely falling apart for Ji-won. But then this leads to the midpoint, and in some stories it would be a crushing defeat for the protagonist, or a huge victory, or a powerful revelation. And for Hyun-soo, it's a revelation. Why is he trying so hard to hold on? Why is he so devastated and confused? I don't know who is more devastated. I mean, I don't think he can really process it, but he is struggling, when Ji-won tells him that she doesn't love him anymore. He's processing all of this. He doesn't want to have the facade, but he feels like he needs to, because he doesn't want to lose his life with Ji-won. So all that leads to this huge revelation where he feels genuinely sorry for putting Ji-won through all of that. And also he realizes that what he's been feeling for her is love all this while. And this is in episode 11. So I would say, it's like 5 episodes for Act 1, about 5 episodes for the first part of Act 2, and then we go on, and the stakes keep getting higher now, because now they are fighting the real villain, which is real and true psychopath Baek Hee-sung. Obviously throughout this journey as well, husband and wife, they do go through some tension of their own, but I think mostly they are fighting the external enemy. And where it all comes to a head is where all is literally lost, as far as Hyun-soo is concerned, because this is when Hee-sung tells him that he killed Ji-won, which is obviously a lie. The audience knows this, but Hyun-soo doesn't know this. And this actually works. Us knowing what he doesn't know actually makes us feel like, oh my god, Hyun-soo, don't do anything, she's alive, And I think that is so great, because that's not really what happens. Sometimes when there is a all is lost moment, the audience are also, they feel the defeat at the same time, because they also go through it at the same time as the protagonist goes through it. But in this case, we know what actually happened, and so that is a nice, I think, fresh way to go about this all is lost moment, where he physically loses the one person that matters the most to him in life. And then we get in the same episode, which is episode 15, the Dark Night of the Soul, where Hyun-soo really drowns. He just goes way down. And the conflict here is that Hyun-soo, we've already established, is not somebody who would kill anyone, but he's coming very dangerously close to it. So at the end of Act 2 is supposed to be like this point where the protagonist has a big idea, or they figured out a way to solve a problem and they have an aha moment or something like this. And then this really leads into Act 3, where they prepare for the climax, and Act 3 tends to be really short and very tension filled, right, until they reach the climax, and there could be a twist in between. I would say that this is where Flower of Evil diverges. I would say that straight after the Dark Night of the Soul, it kind of converges together with the climax, because the cliff scene of Flower of Evil is, to me, the climax of the show. And this is where Ji-won comes in, and Ji-won is the one who saves him and essentially is able to bring him out of the Dark Night of the Soul. And then Hee-sung is defeated in that moment, right? So that is Pa is Act 2 to 3 to like mid Act 3 in a moment, the last part of episode 15. And the twist actually comes after that, when we find out that he actually has amnesia now, he being Hyun-soo. And I thought it was very clever, because you see him closing up all these loose ends, with Hee-sung's parents, the loose ends with his sister, with Moojin, with Ji-won, especially in a twist, essentially, as a person with amnesia. And I know that not everybody really liked it, but I certainly enjoyed it. It was very nice to see him really fall in love with her all over again, this time with a little bit more understanding of what he's going through in his heart, and slowly remembering certain things from his past. It was nice also to see him go about the court case kind of like a changed person. And Haesoo really comments on this, like, he's Hyun-soo, but not really Hyun-soo. Like, he's probably more him than he's ever been. So he really gets to have a new start, and the best thing about it is that when he has to search for a starting point for this life as a free man, free to live as himself, he goes back to Ji-won. And the writer actually saves all the parallels for the last episode here, for the falling action, which keeps it fresh and which keeps the pacing really nice. With a lot of dramas, the climax is somewhere in the middle of episode 16, and the falling action, the wrap up is really quick, 20-30 minutes, right? Which is cool, because you want to keep the audience engaged the whole time. But you can also do something like this in Flower of Evil, where essentially the climax is over, and the so-called quote-unquote boring part of the show actually becomes like so engaging, because would he get his memories back, and you see a new sincerity in Hyun-soo, and I think Moon Chae-won also does a really good portrayal of what Ji-won could be going through at that moment. And there's still a little bit of tension there, the kind of pain of having to let go, but it all ties up really, really well at the end. And I thought that it was not necessary for him to figure everything out, because the thing was, and the thing I think it could be a commentary on marriage as well, isn't it? That there's times when you don't have everything figured out, but because you love a person, you choose to love a person, and you choose to work things out with them. I mean, that's really part of a relationship as well, and that made it so poignant for me. And that moment with Yunha is that, you know, he remembers Yunha, but maybe not completely. He doesn't remember all the memories, but his love for her is so strong, and her love for him is so constant, and it's a beautiful ending. And so I think that this show should be praised for the writing. And I hope that you enjoyed my kind of little analysis of it. I'm not 100%, of course, I'm not a pro, but I look forward to watching this show many more times. Lee Joon-gi, the actor, said that, you know, the more times you watch it, the more you would appreciate it, and I certainly think so. This would be one of my favorites for time to come.